So good morning once again, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, The Future of Stone Crab Fishing in the Bahamas. This webinar is a collaborative piece between the Cape Eleuthera Institute, the Perry Institute for Marine Science, and the commercial stone crab fishers here in the Bahamas. So today our speakers are Dr. Eric Schneider, a senior research scientist and lab manager at the Cape Eleuthera Institute. His work focuses on improving the sustainability of fisheries and conserving marine biodiversity. Candace Britton, our strategic communications and outreach coordinator here at PIMS with over 10 years experience working with stakeholders. Her approach to conservation is to prioritize people's needs and well-being to find solutions to environmental challenges. Candace's mission is to support natural resource management by increasing stakeholder participation in research and conservation by making science accessible to resource users and the general public. Just a note before we start, this webinar is being recorded, and also a reminder to remain muted during the session unless prompted otherwise. Also, if you have any questions during the webinar, please post it into either the chat box or the Q&A box, and they will be addressed appropriately. So without further ado, I will now welcome our speakers to begin their presentation.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Danielle. Like she said, my name is Eric. I'm a research scientist at the Cape Eleuthera Institute.
And good morning, my name's Candace. As Danielle mentioned, I am the Strategic Communications and Outreach Coordinator for PIMS. We're so sorry for the technical issues at the start of this webinar, but we're excited to be here today to talk a bit more about our work on the stone crab fishery and the future of stone crab fishing in the Bahamas.
One second, having trouble switching slides. There we go. Okay, so for a little bit of background on the fishery, the photo here, this is a Florida stone crab, although this is the species that is native here in the Bahamas. It is a claw-only fishery, meaning the crabs are caught, the claws are removed if they meet a legal size minimum, and then the crab is thrown back. And it's a relatively young fishery in the Bahamas, classed as an emerging fishery. It's only been fished commercially for about 20 years or so, but it already is the third largest export fishery in the country. And it's a really interesting seafood product because the price per pound of stone crab claws actually increases the larger the claw is. So whereas with, let's say, crawfish, you might get, $12 a pound or a set price per pound, regardless of how big the tail is. Stone crab claws, they get more expensive the larger the claws get.
So in the Bahamas, there are some marine resource management challenges. And this is really down to the size of the Bahamas. There are 700 islands and 2,400 keys. So enforcement is incredibly challenging just because of that island fragmentation. It can be really, really difficult to be in all of those different locations. And so what's really important to think about is, particularly when you think about marine resource management, having fishers that choose to do something versus trying to enforce something can actually be a more effective way of managing marine resources if people are willing to choose to do something, because policing that across that island fragmentation can be so challenging. So in the Bahamas, there are some stone crab regulations. We're actually just entering the first day of the close season today. So the close season runs from the 1st of June to the 15th of October. And that's really to allow stone crab to reproduce and replenish the next generation of stone crab. It is illegal to harvest claws from an egg-bearing female. So you can see in the top image there's a stone crab with some eggs. There is a size measurement for claws, and they need to be 4 inches to be taken. What's really interesting is we actually, on different islands, we realized fishers were measuring claws in different ways, and there was a bit of a discrepancy. So the image you can see on the bottom there is how typically we would measure a claw from a scientist's perspective. But we did find in different areas, people had different beliefs, and there's not actually any size measurement written into law other than 4 inches. It doesn't say where you have to measure that. You can actually harvest 2 claws as well, as long as they are 4 inches.
So a little bit about what stone crab fishing looks like. So stone crab's preferred habitat, or where they live, is typically in parts of the ocean with a softer bottom. So they need a little bit of mud, some seagrass is good, because they have those big claws, because their main diet is hard-shelled organisms that like to burrow in the sand. So clams and mussels and things like that. So stone crabs are caught using baited traps like the one shown here. This one's a plastic trap. That's a pretty common design. Some use wooden traps with an entrance on the top of the trap. Most of the fishing is in pretty shallow, maybe 15 to 30 feet deep, baited typically with pig's feet or fish carcasses. Traps are left to soak or left out in the sea for about a week before they're hauled back. Any legal sized crabs are then harvested. The claws are harvested, and then the crab is thrown back. Yeah, this fishing happens throughout the fall, winter, and spring months.
So throughout all of the projects we're going to talk today, fisher collaboration was incredibly important to the success of this work. So it is a common issue that fishers don't always trust scientists, and there's really valid reasons for this. At times, researchers can exclude fishers from their work, or fishers can feel shamed. It happens a lot in research and conservation, where fishers are sometimes asked to stop doing something, or are excluded from being involved in the research process. And so it can lead to distrust. And so what we wanted to do was actually involve fishers throughout the entire process in our work. And so we had fishers participating in our research question design. We had fishers come into the lab. You can see in this picture is one of our collaborators, John, actually collecting data with us in our lab. And then we wanted to make sure we were actually sharing all of our research back with the fishing community. And again, fishers helped us design all the outreach and messaging to the work we're going to talk about.
So as Candace mentioned, the stone crab work that we've been doing has been done hand in hand with some fisher collaborators from the get-go. This work started about maybe 6 or so years ago. And it actually started with conversations that we were having with some stone crabbers here in the Bahamas, who had really interesting questions that they were interested in the answers to. We didn't know the answers to, so we started working together to try to figure some of this stuff out. One of the initial questions that came up was we talked to some folks who were saying, we fish in the same area year after year, but we very infrequently, we almost never catch crabs that we've already harvested. So they weren't seeing crabs in the traps that had already had their claws removed. So we were all wondering, what's happening here? Do the crabs get trapped once and then learn to avoid the traps? Can they not physically climb back up the traps if they don't have the claws? Are they dying? What's going on here? So first we took a look at some previous work that had been done in Florida, where there's a big fishery for stone crab. So this one experiment was trying to understand how many stone crabs die after you crack their claws off or their biters off. And so to give you just a kind of rough estimate here, mortality, meaning how many crabs are dying after the harvest process. So on average, if you take one claw off, about 40% or just over a third of crabs die. If you take two claws off in this study, it was almost 2/3 of crabs were dying. And this was without any predators. So they were harvesting claws, putting the crabs back into a sealed off trap. So that was just dying from the claw removal process. And if you look at the photo here, this is one of the things that can result from a claw removal. So you can see a little bit of muscle, a little bit of flesh hanging off the end of that biter there. And so if you pull some of that muscle tissue out, or if you crack that joint in a bad way, it's called a bad break, then it's actually almost like 85% of the crabs die if you make a bad break. So the traditional harvest method that had been used throughout Bahamas and in Florida is what we call a forced break in our experiments. In the Bahamas, it's called clipping. So to clip the claw off or clip the biter off, you basically just crack the claw off in a sharp downward motion. And this is one of the things that can result in that. If you don't get a good clip, you can have a bad break that leads to some of the crabs dying.
And so if you've ever seen a lizard being chased by a cat and the cat pounces on the tail, you'll see that the lizard just drops its tail. And just like a lizard drops its tail, a stone crab can drop their claw when they're feeling threatened. And this process is called induced autotomy. So it's really just means they're choosing to drop the claw. But what we found is this actually significantly increases crab survival when you compare that to the forced break or clipping the biter off.
So we have a couple of videos here. So this first one is one of the fishers that we'd work with. So this is clipping a biter off. This is the force break. You can see it's just a quick, sharp downward crack. It takes the claw off right at what you can think of as the shoulder joint, as he's pointing to there. This next video is showing this induced autotomy. Again, autotomy just means self-removal. So if you puncture that soft membrane in what you can think of as the elbow joint of the crab, the claw just drops off, but it drops off at the shoulder joint also. So it's really interesting. Basically, the crab is perceiving some damage to the claw. So it's thinking, I'm being attacked, something is broken on my claw. It's got a puncture. Basically, you stick it right in that soft membrane, as you can see here, and then the claw just pops right off right there, but no twisting or cracking or forcing is involved. So this last video here is from the experiment that we ran. So we wanted to compare these two different harvest techniques, this force break or clipping, and then this induced autotomy, where you stick it in the joint and the crab drops its claw off, and look at how many crabs were dying as a result of both of those two harvest techniques.
And I'm just going to show you another video here. This was another fisher that we've been working with, and he's really perfected this technique. I will say he was doing it slower than he normally does so that I could video it. But you can see in the experiments, we just used an ice pick because that's what we had around. He was popping it in the midway joint, and you could see the claw just popped off really nicely. So John Cartwright was one of the main collaborators we worked with. He has been fishing stone crab in the Bahamas for nearly 20 years. He works for Double Eagle Fishing. He owns that company. And he actually donated every crab we used in this study. So he's been a really, really important collaborator in all of this work, from the designing of questions, being in the wet lab, collecting data with us, and then also thinking about messaging and how we share this research out with the fishing community.
And so we put that photo of John in there because he was part of the data collection team, so part of the research team for this experiment. So what we were trying to do was try to figure out how many crabs survive and die after you take claws off with these two different methods. Now, John is one of the first commercial crabbers in the Bahamas. He's been fishing crab for about 20 years. I, on the other hand, don't have nearly as much experience. So we kind of represented two different scenarios there, a really experienced commercial harvester and a less experienced, maybe recreational harvester. But it was important to kind of get both of those harvesters into this experiment. So just to summarize what we found from this, basically we took claws off of the crabs using one of those two methods. We held them in tanks in our wet lab, and then we tracked their survival over the course of about a month and a half. Now, it actually seemed like when crabs die from the claw removal process, we found that it happens pretty quickly. Essentially, they bleed out, and it takes between 1 and 3 days for them to die if they are going to die from the claw removal process. So this is 100 crabs shown on this graphic here. So when you clip one biter off, meaning if you take one claw using the traditional method, the forced break, or just cracking them off, about 25% of those crabs die. So that generally matches what we saw from that study in Florida. So about a quarter of the crabs die if you take off one with the traditional method. But if you take off one with the stick it method, so using this new method where you pierce the soft point of their joint, only about 5% die. So that's a 20% increase in survival of crabs taking one claw off just based on how you remove the claw. So then we wanted to look at two as well, because it is legal to take two claws if they meet the minimum size requirement. So when we took two claws off, clipping them off or cracking them off, 52% of them died. So that's over half the crabs died when we took two biters off. But then when we switched methods and used this new method, the stick it method, here, it was only 11% die. So that's an even bigger increase. That was a 41% increase in the crab survival, literally just based on the technique that you use to harvest the claws, which is really interesting. And then we wanted to kind of model this out a little bit to say, what would that look like over the course of a fishing season for one of these stone crab boats? So let's say you're part of a fishing crew that might catch 100,000 stone crabs in a season, which is feasible for some of the bigger operations here in the Bahamas. So if you were using the traditional method, even if you have a lot of experience, as John does, if you catch 100,000 crabs in a season, you're cracking one claw off, you might be killing 25,000 crabs inadvertently. And if you're taking 2 claws off of both of those, you might be killing 52,000 crabs over the course of that season. Whereas if you change the harvest method and use the stick it method, if you take 1 claw off of each of those 100,000 crabs, you might only be killing 5,000 or saving 20,000 crabs every year. If you take 2, you might only be killing 11,000 or saving 41,000 crabs out of 100,000 that you catch for that season. So obviously there's more that will go into this that we'll talk about now, but that's a pretty big increase in the survival rate and therefore the number of crabs that might potentially be saved based on the harvest strategy. So when you just put those last 2 panels together, so we wanted to average this out because not everybody only takes 1 claw, not everybody takes 2 claws, or you might not have all the 2 claws being of legal size. So when you put all the data together, using the traditional method or clipping them off using the force break, it's about 37% of crabs were dying in our experiment. And then if we go to the next slide here, changing the method, it's only about 8% die. So overall, when you average everything out between 1 claw harvest and 2 claw harvest, changing this harvest method might save about 29% more stone crabs using this different practice.
And so we thought it was really important to share all of this research back with the fishing community. So we created some goals to increase knowledge and awareness of the stick it method. We wanted to encourage fishers to try this new claw removal technique. We wanted to think about what fishers would be willing to use in terms of a tool and also how they could implement it on their boats in a commercial fishing operation, and ultimately create an industry best practice where this is the new technique that stone crabbers use. And to do this, we really thought it was important to think about effective communication tools. So how can we share this information out? We wanted to hold fisher workshops and design that concept for a low-cost tool that fishers are willing to use moving forward. So part of the messaging we designed, again, it was all in collaboration with commercial fishers. We tested the messaging with them. They gave us really great feedback and said we should incorporate Bahamian dialect. So don't clip the biter, stick it. So clip is that force break, the traditional way of harvesting them. The biter is the claw, and the stick it is that method of sticking it in the joint. And so that was the messaging we decided to move forward with. We also wanted to make sure we were including stories told by real people, because we think that's a much more effective way to share information. So John Cartwright, as we've already introduced him, he's a really respected stone crabber in country. He's quite widely known, and he was part of this research process from the very beginning. So he has a really powerful story and information that he can share. But most importantly, when we talked about earlier on that fishers don't always trust scientists, John is trusted, and he was also involved in the data collection. So he believes the science because he was part of the team that collected it. So his story was really important. I'm just going to play a quick video that we made that could be shared on WhatsApp to share this information.
All stone crabbers, new method of stone crab. You don't clip the biter, you stick it in the joint and it releases itself. It's a new way of declawing the crab. So you gotta set up a post that ain't gonna move. You hold the crab, and you can turn the biter and you can stick it in there, push it, jiggle it until the claw come off.
Using this new technique where stone crabs drop their biters is a great way to ensure that more crabs are surviving after you release them so that they can regrow their claw and go on to reproduce. So remember, don't clip the biter, stick it.
And so that was a really nice, easy video that we could send around for fishers to see this technique. We also designed different infographics, again, with really nice visuals that were straight to the point about what we were asking people to do. And really importantly, again, really, really easy to share. So I want to talk a little bit about tactics for how we decided to share information. I want to say a really big thank you to the Moore Foundation that supported all of our communication throughout this project. We've started off with thinking about what are the familiar communication channels that people are used to receiving information, but also how they trust information. And in the Bahamas, this can be really challenging because typically, if you look at previous social science projects, most people say they receive information through word of mouth, and that's how they trust the information. They also receive information from WhatsApp and Facebook and familiar people they're connected with already. So we wanted to utilize that as a communication channel. we wanted to think about local champions. So John was really one of our local champions. Early adopters has been using this fishing practice, but has also been part of the data collection, so people trust him. And then more with trusted messengers, we wanted to think about what networks already exist that we can utilize reaching fishers in a way that they will trust the messaging. So we reached out to the National Fisheries Association of the Bahamas. They have a very active WhatsApp group. We shared all of our work with them and they said, hey, we endorse this messaging. We think it's really important that fishers get to hear about this. So we'll share your communication tools through our network. And that was incredibly helpful for us reaching more people within the Bahamas. Additionally, the National Fisheries Association also had a goal to expand their network across family islands. So what we actually offered to do was to pay for NFA reps to come to all of our fisher workshops so that there was an equal benefit, right? Because I think one of the things that's really important to think about is that there has to be mutual benefits when you're asking people to partner with you. And then we wanted to utilize all of those tactics so that we got fishers to fisher recommendations. So if a fisher heard the information, they could see it, they could try it themselves, and then they might recommend it to someone else if they believed it was a good idea. And so we also did fisher workshops. We reached 60% of permitted crabbers directly in country in person across 4 islands. One of the really exciting things was we actually had fishers calling us after meetings saying, one of my friends or someone I've worked with went to your meeting. I was really interested to learn more about this. Can you hold another meeting? So that was really exciting for us. Most of the fishers in our meetings were willing to actually try this new technique. And when we were able to bring live crabs into our meetings, we found that was really, really helpful because the stone crabbers could do it. Obviously, a lot of those guys are much, much more experienced than us at this. And so it was really exciting to see them doing this and testing out and showing us the way they think it might work. The other really important thing was we had a large amount of fishers that came to our workshops actually express being wanting to be involved in future research. And so fishers were saying, we do want to be part of this research process moving forward. There were some concerns that fishers raised that I think are really important to share. So one of them was fisher safety. Obviously, if you have a spike mounted on a boat, that is not the safest thing for a fisher. So one of the things we asked people to do over the course of this fishing season was to test out different ways they could make it work on their boats and their commercial operations. Another one was harvest time. So they were concerned it might take a lot longer to take the claws off this way. Some of the early adopters have got this down to 1 second per crab, so we're not really worried about that. Another issue fishers raised was food safety. So if you're puncturing a hole in a food product, they were worried that either pathogens could enter the meat or that having that open hole might create some kind of problem for food safety. So we did speak to the people that run the HACCP course, and they said as long as you're following the food safety practices for stone crab, which is essentially as soon as you clip the biter off, you're going to put it on ice on your boat or cook it. Once you get into land, if you don't have a cooking operation on your boat, you take it straight to cook and then you freeze it. And so they weren't actually worried about this. I will also say we had a research team working on this for over a year. They were eating all of the claws and none of them got sick. So we're not really worried about that either. Another concern that was really valid was the aesthetics of the product. People were concerned if we have a big hole in our claws, maybe our buyers will no longer want the product because it will be viewed as damaged. We did speak to some exporters and they said they were still happy to buy the claws. That also the hole is so small when you use an ice pick, you can't actually really see it. And as soon as you cook that claw, that actually seals over and closes. And so some fishers had some really good ideas for different tools they could use. So one of them was having an integrated spike in a glove. So you just have a glove and you can come in and stick the crab. Another one was having a spike on a retractable guard. So you have something protecting fishers when they're not actually sticking the crab. Another one was very similar, having it on a pedal instead. So a spike on a pedal. One of the guys we've been working with actually has a crab restraint. So he has a board that he sticks a crab into and it holds its claws up. And then he just takes a pick, an ice pick by hand and then sticks them that way. And another guy we met said whenever he has a new person on his fishing crew that maybe isn't the best at breaking claws, he actually gives them garden clippers or shears. And that helps the crabs drop them off, which takes us to another really exciting project that we ran really quickly. Maybe you want to go into it quickly.
Yeah, so in this process of trying to figure out how to get the time down to get the claws to drop to get the crabs to drop the claw off quickly. What's the best tool? Is there a specific angle that you want to puncture the joint with? We incorporated this into that study. So we were trying different tools, an ice pick, a bait knife, different tools that, might have better or worse functionality for this. And then we also tried this garden shears method that one of the crabbers says he gets new deckhands to use if they're not good at clipping the claws off. So the preliminary data that we've seen from that, the garden shears do improve the survival of the crabs compared to the traditional method when you force break it. But it's not quite as good as using this induced autotomy or the stick it method. But it was a really cool feedback loop, right? We got this idea from one of the fishers that we work with, incorporated that into the next experiment so that we can actually come out of it with some data to, move forward with and share again. And then I can take this one. So now just kind of like what are we going to do from here and what we're hoping to see. We do know that some of the fishers that have come to our meetings have been using this method. This is a video from a trap that came up recently from one of our collaborators who has been using the stick it method this season. And this is exactly what we were hoping to see and what we have been seeing, which is a trap that has 2 crabs in it. Both of them have had their claws removed, indicating that those claws were likely harvested already by this fisher, but survived the harvest process. So now obviously that's one trap, that's one data point that we don't want to jump to conclusions, but we are moving from here to do some tagging work to see if this increase in survival that we saw in the lab actually translates to out in the sea. So we'll be going out fishing with some of these guys, putting tags like this one here in crabs, putting them through different harvest processes. So using the stick it method, using the force break method to try to see if what we're seeing in the lab actually translates to the field.
And then another project that we're going to be working on is actually following up with all the fishers we've connected with to document the behavior change. So from all of these communications, from our collaborative work, how many people are now actually using this new method? What is their feedback? What works? What doesn't work? So that we can actually document the impact of all of this work. But there are a couple of lessons learned that we've really thought about in our collaborative efforts to do this. Listening is probably the most important thing we've done. None of this work would have happened if we didn't have dialogue with fishers and we weren't listening to what they were saying. And ultimately, they drove all of our research questions and helped us design them. Another one is respect and confidentiality. So we have worked with a lot of fishers. We always try and be very respectful, but we also maintain confidentiality. A lot of people have secret phishing sites, they have tricks to the trade, and people have been really, really generous with the amount of information they've shared with us. And what we always do is offer confidentiality, and we do not share the information with anyone outside of our research team. Also, speaking the language is really important. So that reminder from fishers that we should be incorporating Bahamian dialect is a really, really important one, right? Speak the language of people you're trying to reach. Who the messenger matters. So having John as our key messenger was so important, we think, to the success of this communication campaign about this research. And using those trusted communication channels, so word of mouth, WhatsApp, Facebook, really, really important for people to receive information in a way that they trust. Also thinking about mutual benefits, it is so important that if you're trying to have partnerships with people, that there's benefits to them. And what's really exciting, particularly with John and some of the other fishers we've worked with, is John donated all of the crabs to our research project. That is a significant amount of money, but he sees the benefit because in the long term, it could sustain his future income. We also think about one of the fishers we're working with now on the mark and recapture study. We do collaborative fishing, and he called us one day and said, my boat broke down, I've got traps out. So we said, hey, we'll bring one of our boats out, we'll help you fish. And there's a benefit for him. So we're not asking people just to do stuff for us, we're also trying to think about what the benefit is to them as well. So thank you so much for joining us on our webinar today. Again, I'm very, very sorry for the initial challenges. I do want to say a really big thank you to More Bahamas Foundation for supporting our work, Double Eagle Fishing, and all the other fishers we collaborated with. You'll see there's a big QR code that's going to take you, if you scan it, to a longer video on YouTube that talks a bit more about our work. And in the chat, you're going to be sent out a survey, just a quick evaluation of this webinar. It won't take more than 2 minutes, so we'd really appreciate it if you could quickly fill that in. And we'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for listening.
Alrighty, thank you so much, guys. So as they mentioned, any questions that the audience may have, maybe you would like some clarity on what was said, so feel free to either raise your hand or you can post it in the Q&A box. Okay, so we do have a question from Valeria. Do you know if similar studies are currently done in other Caribbean areas?
So it's an interesting question. One of the things that we're trying to figure out is where else in the Caribbean stone crab fisheries exist. There's not a ton of information out there. There's a really big fishery for stone crabs in the southeast of the US. So that's around Florida, up the Gulf Coast a little bit, and even up the east coast of the US. We assume by proximity that there's probably some stone crabs in Turks and Caicos. Yeah, there's not a lot of information on other stone crab fisheries in the Caribbean. That's something that we're actively trying to make contacts for and try to figure out, because we are interested in expanding this and kind of getting the word out. But yeah, not entirely sure yet if there's many other fisheries.
I believe there might be fisheries in Belize and Mexico as well.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Another question is, where can we access the video showing the stick-it method?
I can reshare the screen, 1 second, and there is a QR code that you should be able to scan.
So while Candace is pulling up the QR code, I'll just go ahead with the next question, if you guys don't mind. Charlotte is asking, are there other crab species which this could be applicable to?
Yeah, so that's something that we are also very interested in and potentially excited about. So we have tried this method on a couple other crab species around us. So there's a big type of spider crab, a channel crab. People might have different names for them. This big lanky crab that lives on the reefs and in blue holes around here. They do drop their claws off as well. It's a little bit more difficult. There are blue swimmer crabs, this smaller species that we have here in the Bahamas as well in lower numbers, and they're a bit smaller. It also works for them as well. But one thing that we're interested in sort of figuring out is what other crab fisheries might be actually suitable to be a claw only fishery. So it's interesting just to know, in theory, this response, it's really like a survival response, right? If they're being predated upon, they want to just get rid of one claw or one leg instead of being eaten by a predator. But even if it does work, it might not necessarily be useful in every crab fishery, because if there's crab fisheries that are targeted specifically to eat the body of the crab, or if they have really small claws. So we're interested in kind of figuring out other crab fisheries that have really big claws. It's interesting, stone crabs, their claws can be up to 60% of their body size, which is a huge proportion of their total body weight. We don't think there's too many other species out there that have a ratio like that, but that's something that we're interested in finding out as well.
Alrighty, so just 2 points before I move on to the next questions. Candace has pulled up the QR code on the screen if you're interested in accessing the video, as well as, yes, there has been a link shared in the chat as well to access a video, and also the survey mentioned by the presenters that we would really appreciate that you fill out. That link has also been shared into the chat. So if you guys can just, get access to the link, that would be great. But moving on to the next question. So we have a question from John. They're saying, although they're not Bahamian, their family has had property in Abaco for 50 years and they spent half the year there. How could they help spread this very interesting information to their friends and fishers in Abaco?
I think share the video, share the infographics. What we can do actually, everyone that registered for this webinar, I can send a follow-up email that will have a link to the videos we've used, the infographics. And then again, it's really people just seeing it and then trying it. Because I think, you can hear something, but when you actually see it working, that's the most important way. And we've had a lot of fishers that have reached out to us saying, we actually tried this and now this is the only way we fish. And so I think you've got to see it to believe it, right? And fishers are seeing it working. So I think share the videos, share the infographics, tell people to just try it. Our really important thing was we don't want people to feel like they're forced to do this. Give it a try. If you see it working, maybe you want to keep doing it.
Mm-hmm. And feel free to share our contact information here. We're constantly trying to build our network of relationships with stone crabbers in the country, because a lot of the really interesting things that have come out of the last 6 years of doing research have, like we said, been from these conversations, right? Because we have the scientific background, but nobody's spent more time out on the water than these crabbers and had more time handling the crabs. So they pick up on the little nuances, right? That video, the second video that we showed, one of the fishers that we worked with was the one who figured out, okay, if you take this ice pick and stick it at a very specific angled in towards the body of the crab, it releases the claw almost instantaneously. Where we ran this whole experiment looking at different tools and different, parts of the joint, and we couldn't get the time consistently down that low. And he turned up to one of our meetings one day and said, hey, I've been using this on my boat. And he went through 4 or 5 crabs and every claw came off, within half a second. So yeah, feel free to share our contact information, because that collaborative nature of this project, a lot of benefit has come out of it so far, and we're interested in hearing more.
Awesome, thank you. So I will ask one more question from the Q&A box, and then I do see a raised hand, so I'll move on to that next. But first, Natasha's asking, is there an estimate of how many times a crab can have its claws commercially removed, considering the allowable size over its lifetime?
Yep. So that's a good question. Stone crabs on average probably live about 7 to 8 years. And it's interesting, we had read this, but John told us all of this and was pretty much spot on with what the science has shown also. So stone crabs will typically reach harvestable size in about 3 years. And John always told us you can get 3 clips out of the crab. So it can take about 1.5 years to regrow a claw to the full harvestable size. So again, if you start at 3 years, max life is maybe 7 or 8 years, you probably got about 3 regenerations. Another really interesting thing is, let's see if we can go back to a photo of one of the stone crabs. So they have 2 different shapes to their different claws. The larger claw is called the crusher claw. That one, if you look on the inside of the claw, you can kind of see it. This one on the left is the larger one. It almost looks like it has a molar, so your back teeth, and that's for crushing those hard-shelled organisms. And then the other claw is a bit smaller and looks a bit more like a serrated knife. So that's called the pincher claw, or the manipulator. And that one's used for, pulling apart the meat of whatever it just crushed. Now, it's really interesting. So if you took both claws off of this crab here, it might take 2 years to grow both of its claws back to full size, maybe even 3 years, because we have a pretty big size limit here in the Bahamas. But if you only take the crusher claw, the bigger one, over the next molt cycle, so the crabs shed their shell off about once a year when they're adults, it's called molting, they can actually change that pincher claw into a crusher claw. So it cuts down the time that they have to wait for that big crusher claw to reform again. So they can actually change the shape of their claw when they're going through that molting cycle.
And almost one of the things that's really important is not just the claw regrowing, but the crab actually surviving so that it can continue to reproduce. So it's great if they're growing back claws, that sustains the fishery somewhat, but more importantly, if crabs are surviving, they're still carrying on to reproduce. And we think that's the most important part for sustaining the fishery.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. We do have a raised hand, so I'll just ask you to unmute yourself. This is Gregory Bethel, the representatives. Okay, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Not quite. So, hello, Ken. This is Nigel Sands. I'm with the Department of Human Resources now. But you said interesting quote earlier in regards of harvesting the crop, harvesting stone biters, right? I just want to ask, it's legal to harvest to the size, which is not against the law. But are you seeing a lot of fishermen actually collecting the pincer as well?
Yeah, so it depends on the size. So the good thing in the Bahamas is people actually really do follow the size limit, because the value is the bigger the claw is, the more money you get for it. And so most Bahamian fishers follow those regulations really strictly, because if they take a small one, they're not going to get much money for it if they wait one season and it grows bigger. So fishers will take them if there are two claws that are 4 inches. I have seen fishers do that, but if they're not 4 inches, they'll only take one. And that's like consistent with every person we've been out fishing, because it's a waste, right? You're like losing money your next season if you take an undersized claw.
Mm-hmm. And some even will leave legal size claws on the crab for that exact reason. Where if they're in the maybe medium or large size class, it might be a legal claw, but a lot will leave that one as well to take the jumbo or the colossal, the really big crusher claw, and leave that one that is already a legal size, but wait for the next season for it to kind of get into that next size class.
All right, thank you, Candace. I'll reach out to you shortly, though.
Yeah, good to hear your voice. It's been a while.
Likewise.
Okay, great. We have another question from Dawson. I hope I'm pronouncing that. So you can unmute yourself and you can go ahead with your question. I'm not sure. They're not unmuting themselves, so I'm not sure if that was an accidental hand raise. But in the meantime, do we have any more questions from the attendees? You can raise your hand or you can insert it into the chat box. Sorry, the Q&A box. Okay, we have another hand raised from Carlin. So can you see if you can unmute yourself to ask your question, please?
Yes, good morning to everyone and to the host.
morning.
My question is that, we speak about the crab using their biters for food. What about defense? I think taking both biters would still leave the crab vulnerable to natural predators.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's something that we are actually trying to work to answer that question. So one interesting thing, there's really almost no information on stone crab predation, on what eats stone crabs. So if you think we've got really big stone crabs here in the Bahamas, based on the habitat that they're in and the size of the crab and the thickness of the shell, personally, we think the only things that are probably able to predate on big stone crabs would be, a big nurse shark, a big ray, maybe a triggerfish or something like that. And we're constantly asking the fishers that we work with, have you seen stuff eat stone crabs? What's eating them? It would seem right that these two big claws are probably important for predation. defense. And we actually have an experiment right now running in our lab, exactly trying to answer that, to look at the interactions between stone crabs and predators when they have one claw removed, two claws removed, or when they still have both of their claws. So that'll be a little teaser, and hopefully we'll have some more information to try to answer that question, but that's a great point.
All right, thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you, Carlin. We have another question in the Q&A box. Charlotte is asking, does the claw removal impact reproductive output at all?
Another good question. So we can't definitively say. There hasn't been a lot of research on that. Based on other species and similar studies, it likely does. So some of the work that has been done in the past has looked at the indirect effects of claw removal. So a direct effect, right, would be mortality or the crab dying right after you crack the claws off from bleeding out or something. But if the crab survives that process and you've taken both of its claws or even one, it's still going to have some indirect impacts. So what we've shown in a previous study was that, first of all, with each additional claw that you take, the crab uses more energy to go into repairing that injury and sort of the maintenance, or you can think of it as like catching itself basically after this traumatic event. Now, animals have, you can think of as like a fixed energy budget. They have a fixed amount of energy that they can put into all the things that they need to do in their life. So if you're putting more energy into an injury or trying to heal after an injury, then that's going to be less energy that comes away from everything else. And reproduction is one of those things. So we do think that with each additional claw you take off, the reproductive output is probably a bit lower. We think, and again, there's not much information on this. We've been trying to figure it out a little bit. It seems like they can still mate with their claws completely removed, but their reproductive output, so basically how many eggs or babies they can make, probably does go down. There's also some interesting work that shows that even if you take both claws off, the stone crabs can still feed themselves, but they just move to a much lower quality diet. So if you think that big claws for cracking really rich food sources like clams and mussels, and if they can't do that, they move to more of a sort of a scavenging or a foraging diet where they're probably eating detritus off the seafloor, maybe some algae or seagrass or something. So again, with a lower quality diet, that's also going to lead to sort of a lower reproductive output. Pretty much
Awesome, thank you.
Pretty much everything has shown that best practice is to take one, right? The energy budget is a little bit better if you leave one claw. They can feed themselves a little bit better if you leave one claw. Not sure about the mating or predator defense yet, but yeah, best practice is definitely take one.
Okay, great. Does anyone else have any more questions? We are about to wrap up soon. So this is your last chance. Any other questions? If not, we would like to thank everyone for your questions, and we would also like to thank you all for joining us today to learn more about the future of stone crab fishing in the Bahamas. We would also like to thank our presenters this morning. And again, sincerest apologies for the technical difficulties. But for more information, please visit our website at perryinstitute.org. Follow us on our social media channels at Perry Institute for Marine Science, and that includes our Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And also, please join us in July for our next webinar focused on our work supporting education and capacity building in the Bahamas. Again, thank you so much, and please enjoy the rest of your day and the holiday weekend. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.